Hey everyone, welcome to another week of the Civo Devops Bootcamp. I'm super excited for this one. So today we have Anais and Alex with us. Thanks a lot, both of you, for joining. And we are going to talk about all things SRE. So feel free to ask your questions, and in order to make it more streamlined, because live stream goes weird with so many things happening at once, and we all the questions get lost. So there's a form in the description below. It's the very first line of the description. As many questions as you want to submit, feel free to do so. But let's kick it off. Start by a little bit of introduction. Alex, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi, I'm Alex. I'm a principal engineer at Civo. I work a lot with the SRE team, maintaining our product and effectively observing our platforms and making sure that we can build out pipelines to help our engineers and developers. Previously to working here, I worked at JP Morgan, Microsoft, Amex, and some other large companies, and have always worked within the DevOps and SRE sphere. I'm also a tech lead for the CNCF for the tag app delivery.
Did I go?
Anais? Yep.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Anais. I'm a site reliability engineer at Civo, so I work within Alex's team. Before that, I was working as developer advocate, and I worked for several years in the blockchain space and then changed to DevOps just about 11 months ago. And before that, I like to highlight that before I changed to the DevOps space 11 months ago, I didn't know anything about Docker. I didn't know anything about Kubernetes, and I kind of had to learn everything from scratch. And then first worked as developer advocate and then transitioned into SRE just a few months ago. And I'm also a CNCF ambassador. So if you have any questions about the CNCF, you can either message Kunal or myself, and we would love to help you out and send you some resources and more.
Awesome. Let's get started. So I'm just going to remove myself and moderate the channel.
Where are people joining from right now? Maybe like some interaction or anything.
Yeah, I'm going to start the stream. Like for the live stream, I can do that. But for questions, please, let me just
in the
see it
chat
right now.
Are there people in the chat
Yeah.
right now? Because I don't see any
Yeah.
comments. Okay.
I
it's
just
working.
started
It's
it now.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's
Okay.
working.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Well, one thing I'm curious about is if people who are joining right now have watched the previous DevOps Bootcamp live streams, or if that's the first one you're watching. Now, this one is specifically on SRE, and we have several questions kind of prepared that we're going to answer, that we're going to tackle during this live stream. We're going to start off with them. And then we have, so that's the first part, and then we have a hands-on part in which we showing you some examples. First of all, some examples that you can use after the live stream and interact with and kind of check out different tools that we're going to show you. But then also we're going to show you how we are using some frameworks and some tools within Civo. And then I'm going to show you also how you can set up a cluster with some tools on it that you would use as SRE on a day-to-day basis. So Alex, do you want to kick us off and with the first question, with the first part?
Absolutely. So I'm a newbie to these streams, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to try and convey some of the things we do and perhaps answer some questions that will help others learn and figure out what this whole thing's about. So the first thing that we wanted to discuss was, what's the difference between DevOps and SRE? It's a really fundamental question you'll hear asked everywhere. And I think that, the simple answer is that DevOps encapsulates a group or a collection of behaviors, tools, and skills, whereas SRE is much more honed around maintaining a product and keeping it reliable. And if you think about typical DevOps activities, it might be building out pipelines, deploying to a cluster, installing monitoring, and then helping multiple teams. Whereas an SRE might be focused within a team to make sure that their microservices are performant, so that if we make a change in the code, it doesn't get worse. And the SRE on that team might be responsible for alerting the team and for also managing the risk. So that if we have our error budget and we say that, hey, you know what, I think we can afford to deploy a new release out because it's only decreasing in performance by 0.01%, that's part of the mandate of the SRE to help you have that forward progress, but keeping you on guardrails. And so when people ask me this sort of foundational difference between them, I think that really SRE is sort of a distillation of DevOps practices. So if you think of it as DevOps as the group of behaviors and practices, and SRE is more the actual job of specifically looking at a product or a life cycle of a team and maintaining that reliability. And this is reflected in how it works organizationally at many companies. You'll see that DevOps teams tend to be in agency-based models. And what I mean by that is that a DevOps team might be 5 or 6 folks who sit within a central team, and they operate the CI/CD, they operate the clusters, and maybe they operate within a large cloud engineering team. Whereas typically SREs are more embedded within their teams, that they can empathize with their fellow engineers and help upskill engineers and their product counterparts to understand about, why do we care about metrics? And that then takes you all the way back to the very famous sort of Google doctrine around SLOs, sort of service level objectives. Why do we care about the things that we're monitoring? And ultimately, I think whether you're an SRE or you're in DevOps, it's to help enable successful and reliable delivery. So I hope that's a good high level.
Awesome. So as an individual, when you are like, just to kind of, I guess, get in more detail, you talked a lot about how SRE looks in organizations, where you would, what kind of responsibilities they would have versus DevOps. Why would an individual building their own project be interested in SRE practices? Why would I want to look at some of the tools? Why would I care about it? Like, I assume a lot of people here watching right now have side projects or just want to get started in the DevOps space, curious about SRE. Why would they want to learn about some of the SRE best practices and tools and processes?
It's a great question, because I think that it's confusing sometimes to folks, and they see it almost like a fork in the road. Do you go with DevOps or SRE? When in reality, it's far more commingled than that. You'll be using DevOps behaviors in terms of building out pipelines and being able to debug clusters, but you'll be doing that in the context of a reliability engineering role where you'll be looking for specific outcomes. And so the reason that I think folks might be interested in looking at what is SRE all about is that it's a very practical implementation of a lot of these skill sets, whether that's observability, whether that's about deployment, whether that's about how does CI/CD builds work. All of this stuff can be distilled into an actual job. And I think sometimes that SRE helps to give a bit more of a laser focus on a career path, whereas DevOps can mean different things in different organizations. DevOps at one large organization like a bank might mean that you build the pipelines in Jenkins. But DevOps at another large organization might mean that you're the person that's helping to run the Kubernetes clusters. There's very different sort of interpretations, whereas SRE is very closely knit to this idea of reliability of certain components. And so therefore, you're really focused on automation and toil, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. Oh, this is a great diagram.
Awesome. Yeah, so I thought about this yesterday, or like the past days, when we were preparing for this live stream, right? And I watched some of here I have some resources that I will I'll show you in a second, that I found really useful in general when I got started with SRE. But here's like 2 of the diagrams of like, they kind of encapsulate the different ways that I hear people talk about SRE. And for example, Google kind of takes this approach of SRE implements DevOps. So you have DevOps practices, tools, and kind of responsibilities. And then you have SRE kind of wrapped around it in a way. That's kind of how I thought about it. But there's this other approach where I feel like that SRE is kind of sitting between the DevOps and the dev team. And obviously you could move those around, right? And you would have then the different sections, or the dev team would be here as well, or something like that. So maybe if you want to provide some thoughts on this diagram as well, if you have any, but that's kind of how I would visualize it, of what is SRE. SRE is not DevOps, but SRE takes a lot from DevOps, but also has like this development aspect to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, the kind of the Venn diagram you have on the right with the overlay. And I think the thing that this really emphasizes is that there is a relationship. The way I like to think about it is that DevOps is the toolkit, right? DevOps is the toolkit where you learn how to use Helm. You might learn how to use various bash commands. You might learn how to operate a cluster. But an SRE role is taking some of those tools and having a practical day job implementation. And again, that's not to say that you cannot be a DevOps engineer and be highly successful. It's just that SRE has a specific set of tools that it wants to use to implement an outcome, whereas DevOps engineers can be far more generalist.
So Kunal is commenting, so basically DevOps includes the practices and SRE is the implementation of those practices.
That's a really good way of phrasing it. Yeah, essentially, DevOps focuses on the entire ecosystem lifecycle. So you might have seen the sort of the infinity symbol that often referred to with DevOps starting at the beginning of left and then all the way around to the deployment and all the way back again. SRE is that on a smaller scale, but focusing on the reliability factor, and it's using some of those behaviors that you would learn through DevOps. And so if you're thinking about a journey into SRE, it's no bad idea to start thinking about what is DevOps 101. And as some of the previous streams will help to illustrate, it's a great way to get started and to start to figure some of these answers out for yourself and what you like more about it. Yeah, that's exactly
kind of the
exactly
so
it. Yeah.
In that case, where would you fit SRE in this circle, I guess? Or
It's not so,
how would you like if this is describing DevOps, how would you then relate SRE to this?
it's not so much that you're trying to compete by putting one inside the other. It's
Yeah.
more that the order of scale is different. In that DevOps would be doing this on a organizational or a unit-based level within a company, right? So you might have a DevOps team that helps the various delivery teams to create pipelines to deploy their applications, whereas SRE, as I mentioned earlier, operate typically within teams. So you'd be doing this infinity loop within a team, right? And so there'll be a heavy emphasis on SRE within the monitoring and the feedback part. And one of the things that we haven't spoken about is the interaction with a team as an SRE is very different to a DevOps engineer. When somebody within the team says, hey, let's deploy this cool feature out, it's version 1.1.1, you might want to be able to have an opportunity to say, well, the last two features you deployed decreased our reliability by X%. You know, our latency went up by 50 milliseconds each time. I'm a little nervous that we're going to increase milliseconds again based on trends. So maybe let's think as an engineering team how we can address that reliability issue. And these are the kind of conversations that SREs really try to pick out. And so there's even a QA element there where you see that SREs are caring about the version releases and its implication for reliability for the end user.
Awesome. So I think that provides a nice overview of what is SRE and how does it fit into our development workflow or development lifecycle. Shall we move on to the next part, to the next question? So when you get started with SRE, there's obviously or DevOps, right? You want to learn about it. You might want to learn about the difference between SRE and DevOps and see which one fits better to your skill set or your interests and so on. So we thought we're going to pick out I'm going to pick out some of the resources that I found quite useful. And I'm going to link those later on in the comments so you can check them out after the live stream, or I can post them while Alex is talking next. But basically, some of the resources that are quite popular. One of them is this book by Google on how they implement SRE, of their best practices. It has a lot of theory within it as well. That's kind of then implemented in processes and within tools and so on when you use those. But this is kind of glorified as the handbook. Now, I have not read it all. As you can see, it has a lot of chapters. It has a lot of content. But this is one of the main resources if you want to learn more about SRE that a lot of people would refer you to, that you would go to as the single point, the starter point, let's say. Now, depending on the organization that you're looking at, or that's implementing your SRE or has an SRE team, that will be used differently. They won't all follow the same methodology. They won't follow all the same practices, right? But a lot of them are overlapping. But so this is generally one of the first. And they also have this really nice YouTube series on a lot of the theory behind SRE as well, of what are service level objectives, how to use them, how do they interact with the business, how do they maybe interact with the product team as well. So this is providing a really nice overview. And I think those two resources, especially this playlist, will give you a really good starter point once you if this live stream gets you curious about SRE and you want to learn more about what it actually is. Now, there are a lot more resources. This is also another collection of resources that I found that's linking to a lot more resources as well. So there's some really good overall collections of resources that people have put together that you can make use of. And then something else that I always recommend people, that there are lots and lots of conferences, right? And lots of them are, especially since the last 2 years nearly, have been recorded virtual. And so they are going to be available on YouTube. So if there's something that you're interested in, any tool, any project, any specific career path, I guess, they likely have a conference about that. And you can, for example, look at the SREcon, and they have the previous recordings of the previous one available on YouTube, I believe. And you can check out what are people working on, what kind of tools are they using, what are some of the things that are discussed within the space, and so on, if you look up those conferences. And yeah, so that was the next thing. And then another interesting question is, obviously, a lot of times, how do you actually get started with a career path, let's say, right? So if you want to get started with DevOps or with SRE, I assume, maybe comment in chat if you don't have to comment, but I assume that there are lots of people, like when I got started in the DevOps space, it was due to career reasons, right? So a lot of times we get started with a specific path, with a specific technology, well, because we are either interested in this or because we see career opportunities in that space and with that technology. So something else is how do you get started with SRE? Like, if you want to work as an SRE, how would you get normally started? Now, I probably have a less conventional career path into the field, also into the DevOps field. I was working as developer advocate in a different industry and then transitioned into DevOps as developer advocate. So I had some transferable skills from my previous roles that I took into the DevOps space, and then started learning about different tools such as Kubernetes. And with that, so basically I got started with DevOps and DevOps tools, cloud native tools particularly. So the projects that you can find within the CNCF that are using Kubernetes, that are heavily based on Kubernetes, that's kind of what I got started with, but in general with the DevOps space. And then I kind of transition now to SRE. And that's a different, that's, I guess, not necessarily the career path that I would have taken if I would have had a different choice, or that I would recommend people to take. But here, some of the questions that I would think of if I would think of starting either as DevOps or going into SRE, or what is the career path that people would take for either, is what are the skills that you already have from previous work experience, from your studies, that you can transfer into either one. So, for example, with computer science or software engineering, I would then assume that you have a lot of skills that you can then easily apply into either field, but especially if you have specific skills and you're particularly interested in troubleshooting and solving bugs and so on, then you might be wanting to go into SRE. If you like processes and you like operations and kind of those areas and other things that you do within the DevOps as a DevOps engineer, then you might want to go into DevOps. But yeah, those are some of the questions that I would think of what do you want to spend time on? Do you want to also do engineering work? Do you want to set up guidelines and policies and use cloud platforms? What do you want to do on a day-to-day basis, right? And then what are your career goals? And also, what are the jobs, what jobs are available? Where are long-term perspectives for those different roles, right? So I would always suggest you find areas where you can transfer skills to, and ways that you can acquire new skills, or the skills that are needed within a specific area that will help you kind of advance in that area further. But ultimately, when we talk about SRE versus DevOps, I don't think it's that binary, either starting with one field or then you can get into the other. If you're a DevOps engineer, you have probably lots and lots of skills that can be transferred into the SRE space, or to continue as SRE. So, but general, this is kind of my perspective, and I think that Alex might disagree with this. But so if you're thinking about a traditional career path, I would say that as an SRE, you wouldn't necessarily start off right from college as an SRE. That's my perspective. And certainly, I think that I'm missing a lot of skills that I'm trying now to gain for my work. So I think it's more common that if this is your career path, that obviously has some turns and twists, and you have different roles throughout your career and so on, you would you would kind of go into SRE on a later state, or you would be more, I would say, successful with an SRE at a later state. I know that you, Alex, you have done engineering work before you got specifically into SRE, so maybe you want to talk a bit about that at this point. But that's generally how I perceive it, that a lot of people I see who are working as SRE didn't start off being an SRE.
Yeah, I think this is a great illustration of, I think, what is a common problem at the moment, that the bar to entry has historically been so high, whether you're going into SRE, DevOps, or Linux system administration, you need to have all that prior knowledge. And when you're straight out of university, it can be overwhelming, and it can also be really difficult to get that first opportunity. But one of the things that's changing right now is that with the cloud native landscape, there is now a level set where the technologies are becoming much more accessible. And with Kubernetes as a baseline platform, the language and the taxonomy that we're using to debug systems and the tooling available is just being built. So you're learning it at the same time as the veterans. So when I think about a tool like Prometheus, which we'll talk about later, whether you're straight out of university or you've been in the space for 10 years, you'll both be learning a relatively new technology. And so it means there's no benefit to having that historical background when you're learning this new tool. Another thing is that I didn't mention this before, but SRE is really open to developmental work. So you'll be writing in various languages like Golang and Rust and Python, and you might be writing data exporters, you might be improving services. And that is a real advantage to getting in, because you might come from a computer science background, and whilst you won't have operational or day-to-day experience, having that ability to be able to code is quite useful to get into the SRE space, because a lot of the work is involved in optimizations and improving that reliability that I mentioned about. And specifically in terms of the career path, we are seeing that should be also shifting left, in that there are more junior roles, because again, as SRE is coming out of being quite a fledgling field, it's now establishing a lot more in the last 5 years, and companies are feeling comfortable with bringing in junior engineers and understanding how to nurture them, because it's not purely cloud native. They also need to learn how to debug Linux systems, but there are now those kind of programs in place. And I think that there's a very bright future ahead, especially with some of the free programs, the certifications that are coming out, and that you can self-equip before you even have your first job to be in a place where you feel comfortable that at least you have a relatively good kind of high level or a broad skill set that could be enriched as you work somewhere. So I do think there's a large change. And yeah, in particular to the SRE path, I think that we are starting to see as well that there is always going to be incremental knowledge and learning. It's just the hope is that there'll be less of a jump between these things.
Awesome. I think this is maybe one of our next questions that we're going to tackle. What skills and tools do you need to use?
Is that the question?
One of our next. Yeah, maybe you want to dive into that and then into the next question, since you are taking over now. No? Like,
what skills and tools do we need to use? Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating one. So as I mentioned, with the landscape being a level set, and what I mean by that is by most companies now starting to adopt very similar tech stacks, that actually increases your employability. Because if I go work at Microsoft or I go work at a smaller company, the likelihood is that they're probably going to use the same kind of technologies for delivering products in some parts of the business, right? There might be some sort of Kubernetes implementation. There'll probably be a Jenkins implementation if you're thinking more of the DevOps mindset. And this is an incredible time to be working in the field, because it means you don't have to learn all these different niche systems. You don't have to be a COBOL programmer and hang on to that for 25 years. We can start to diversify. And what that also means is that we can learn the bits of technologies that are useful. For example, I'm pretty well equipped in understanding how Prometheus and Thanos and Cortex work, but I'm not an expert. I know enough to be able to get the answers I need out from the metrics. And so we're changing the relationship with our tools. We're no longer dedicating ourselves at the shrine of learning a single tool, but now we're starting to learn how to ask the right questions to a tool. And if a tool doesn't give you the answers to the questions that you're answering, then there should be a better tool out there. And that is where SRE comes in to shine, because you end up building those tools. I want a CLI that will tell me the health of all my tenant clusters in Civo. I want to see how many people are using Civo. I will build a tool to do that. And again, this is where beautiful cross-pollination between DevOps and SRE is coming into play, because we're now starting to see behaviors driving it. And fundamentally, once you reach a certain level in SRE, and I've hired lots of SRE at Amex and JP Morgan, you'll start to look for behaviors. It's behaviors that are the most important thing here. The curiosity, the ability to have autonomy and to debug. And along your diagram here, it's once you start to get to a certain point in your career, you realize that the technology comes and goes, whether it's a programming language, whether it's a tool, and the most important thing you can cultivate are those kind of inquisitive behaviors that put the team first, put accountability first, and stand up for reliability. And so I think whilst that might be kind of the end game, it's just an interesting kind of observation, I think, to show that that career arc in SRE is very much as you define it.
Now we're gonna address more about Civo and like showcase how you can use Civo and basically use some of the tools that we're gonna showcase and talk about on Civo. But there's another question by Liren, if they're also related of getting started, I guess. Are there any SRE or DevOps-based bootcamps? Now, there are lots of, especially DevOps-based bootcamps that I came across. But as we show you those different resources, and I'm going to link them later, as well as the kind of tools that you can get started with, I would suggest everybody, and that's kind of my blunt opinion, save yourself the money of paying for a bootcamp, since most of them are paid for, and get started with different tools in the space, with different tools that we're going to show you as well now, because through that, you will acquire the necessary skills to get started in those fields. And there are lots of resources that you can check out that are free to use, that are right there. People curate them in their free time. You can use them for free. So there's little need to pay for bootcamps. And if you want to show that you're credible and that you have the skills, pay for a certificate, such as Terraform Associate certificates or Kubernetes specific certificates, versus going into a bootcamp. That's my blunt opinion here, if we're talking about that. But let's dive into the next question of, what was it that you wanted to tackle? It was, how would you get into we kind of discussed it. How would you get into SRE, and what's the profile of some typically working in SRE? So let's talk about how SRE works at Civo. Can you walk us through that a bit, Alex, of how do we do SRE at Civo?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just let me share my screen for a moment. Sure.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Right. So we've talked about SRE being this split of automation, development, and toil. At Civo, we have a similar approach where typically the activities of the SRE team would be a split of these two. But the thing that I think isn't always clear is how does that division get made, and what is the feedback loop for this? And so we have a few ceremonies along the way. So the SRE team at Civo, we carry out what are called Coiled Surveys. They sound like they're kind of full of effort in themselves, but they're not. They're fairly quick surveys that are anecdotal. You know, how much toil did you undertake this week? And that'll be unique to the individual, right? It's not empirical. It will be based purely on your feelings. And this will be one of the first activities we carry out in a week. And that toil survey will tell us roughly kind of how do we feel about the level of work we're doing. And so these are going on in the background. We have toil surveys. We're also having things like leadership surveys. And these are some of the, I guess, canaries in the coal mine for us that are going on in the background whilst we're undertaking our day-to-day work. And so what does this actually look like? Well, I'm putting automation and development, but that's fairly vague. So automation and development, that will be under the guise of fixing alerting. There'll be alerts that trigger on a day-to-day basis. I'll go into this in a minute, but we'll have alerts that fire. It will be investigating those. I'm not sure if folks have seen my my Twitter timeline from a long time ago. I posted sort of a day in the life of an SRE, and you'll have an alert that fires, and the outcome of that alert that fires will be fix that alert. And it might be that it's either going to be a faulty alert or it will be a genuine issue that you have to investigate. And so therefore, you might end up going on a journey where you're debugging and repair a system. So let me give a really simple example. Let's say an alert is firing because an etcd cluster isn't reporting in and it's giving a context exceeding deadline. It might turn out that the SSL certificate that you're using to connect to has expired. And so that's an activity that is part of the automation and development, because the solution to this will be to put it in Cert Manager, right? Cert Manager is a tool just for managing your certificates. And so you've developed a solution to a problem that's fired, which would be toil if you didn't do that. And so if you left that alert to fire, you just manually fixed it, that is an activity that is devoid of value. And I love this phrase. I think it was Jez Humble or perhaps Jennifer Petoff who quoted this: lasting value. That is what toil is. It is an activity that is devoid of lasting value. And so clicking an alert to silence, that is toil. And so at Civo, we spend a lot of time trying to move from toil to development so that anything we pick up in toil is reduced. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that things like toil will be operational support, right? Somebody saying, hey, this thing doesn't work in my cluster, or this thing doesn't work, or in my instance, or here's an incident, because you want to always be trying to push these toil activities into automation and development outcomes. However, this is where SRE has a balance. You never want to go 100%. You never want to be able to be at the point where your team is purely doing developmental work. You approximately want to be 50-50. And I'm not a Google zealot, but the idea within the documentation and the kind of mantra is that you sort of want to split so that you never have more than 50% toil per person. So that if one of the team members, like Anais, is spending 90% of her time on toil, we know we've got a problem, right? And as a team, if we're finding that we're toiling 90% of the time, we need to put the brakes on developmental work, and we need to say, how can we start to automate some solutions? Equally, if we're at 90% automation and we're at a very, very low amount of toil, that means we have too much capacity. Our team is too large, and we need to start to distribute our resources. So SRE is quite a scientific field in the sense that although you're doing anecdotal and non-empirical research, you are starting to create data points that can drive quantitative data at the end of it. And I'll speak more about that if anybody's interested at the end. But fundamentally, there's a delicate balance between a team that we employ at Civo to make sure that our engineers are spending time between operational support and automation and development. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, awesome. Can you share my screen, please, Kunal? Background. I found this. So this is basically the day of a live as an SRE, right?
Oh yeah, that looks familiar.
That's the one you referred to. So just to give you an idea of what you might be doing on a day. Yeah, so let's move on to the hands-on part, and then so we have enough time for questions at the end. So here's a Git repository from a talk that I gave with somebody else a while ago at PrometheusCon, and yeah, with Bartek. So he contributed heavily to this repository. And what I want to show you, you can basically use this demo. So I'm going to link you to the repository in a second, and all the other resources. Zoom in. Okay. Can you see this? There's nothing right now important here to see, okay? So if I didn't zoom in, you didn't miss out on anything. But the point is that you can click through this demo. I will show you, like, here are the instructions, and implement some tools such as Grafana and Prometheus. And you will end up with this really nice Grafana dashboard that will show you a lot of insights into the application. Now, I've already spun up this demo because it takes some time to actually spin it up. And so what you basically have is you will have Grafana, you will have a Grafana dashboard, which will pull metrics from Prometheus. So it's basically a nice display of what's going on with your application. Now you have an application, and that's the main application. And then you have a ping application deployed. So you have basically two applications deployed. And the pinger is basically sending requests to the application of like pinging it. And then the application is just responding with a pong. So you have like these two apps just playing ping pong kind of each other. So it's a really simple Go application. You can also check that out within a repository. But basically, once you click through up to step 9, I think, you will end up with the application and everything set up. And you basically just started by running the script. So you click on the script and it's starting up. Now I'm not going to click it, otherwise it's going to start from the beginning and destroying what I've set up here. But then you can open up Prometheus and Grafana, and this will be your Prometheus interface that you're basically going to start up from. And then you have here your Grafana dashboard, and you can see the dashboard by just going to here to those 4 squares, going to manage, and then clicking this demo dashboard. And then you will see lots of really pretty metrics that are going on. It's like the dashboard of what's going on within the application. So you will see here how many pings to the application are actually successful. Right now, they're like 97% of the pings getting an okay Pong response back. There are about 3% that don't get a Pong response back. So these are all things that you then see like about the application, and they will then help you to optimize the application itself. So you can optimize different parts of the application to maybe get this metrics higher up, right? Now you can view or edit this part of the dashboard, and then you will see here the query from Prometheus that's actually pulling this metrics out. So you can then also go ahead and play around with this query and just see how do those things work. So if I don't know if it actually works. If I just run this, yeah, actually it's returning something because sometimes what you put in Grafana is a little bit different of what you put in Prometheus. But in this case, the same query returns the metrics. So you can also play around with the different queries directly in Prometheus. And there are some really nice cheat sheets, such as this one, that will show you different Prometheus queries that you can do and run in Prometheus, for example. But I mainly wanted to show you this dashboard because that will kind of give you a starting point of what can you actually do with Grafana, or how would actually a dashboard like this be used and interact with the app. Now, once you click further through with this application, so it's basically those are just resources that are running in a Kubernetes cluster, and I'm going to show you in a second also how you can spin up a Kubernetes cluster. And I think this might have timed out just now or not. Awesome. So these are all the resources that are right now running. So we have here our application. Maybe I can zoom in. No, I can't zoom. Can I zoom in? So you can see this a bit better. And then next, you can deploy different types of the application. So you can deploy a ping pong application that has more errors. And once you deploy this, you can then see after time how the dashboard will change and how more errors will be introduced in the application through this new deployment. And you can then basically see where things are going wrong, and you can then analyze what's going wrong. Now, we are not going to do that right now. You can do that in your free time or after this if you're curious. But here's the repository. So you can check that out afterwards and just play around with the dashboard. And I think now I'm going to give it back to you, Alex, and you can show us how we're using Prometheus, for example, at Civo. Sounds good?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just...
Awesome.
Let me share my screen. Great. So I just wanted to sort of run us through at a very high level what we're going to look through in the next few moments, and to just introduce some of you who might not be particularly familiar with observability. I mentioned it a bunch of times earlier on, and it's effectively the way that we can understand what's going on inside of our system. We have a few different things called signal generators. A signal generator is a way of being able to run something through what is effectively a black box and get an answer out the other side, right? Like shining a torch into something and seeing a shadow come out the back, and almost like an X-ray, being able to tell what's going on inside of it. Some of these are opaque, some of these are more transparent. But in this example, we're going to use 3 different signal generators. These signal generators are logs, tracing, and metrics, and they would come from the target system, right? So if I have a, say, a Linux VM, I might want to get the logs from that. And so the Linux VM that might be here will generate logs, right? Every single computer generates logs, Windows computers generate logs, and that's a signal, right? It's generating that signal, and those logs are going to a folder, and they might go to syslog, they might go to some other place. And that's really useful because I can start looking at those logs, I can tell what's going on. Equally, we might have a service running on that computer In the old world, it might be something like Zabbix. In the new world, it might be something like Prometheus, as I mentioned. With the cloud native ecosystem, there are a lot of different options. And equally, we might have tracing, which is the ability to effectively measure between services or functions, and that can give us even more insights. So in the context of this example here, I just wanted to really take away that we have these different ways of measuring signals, and these signals tell us different things, right? A metric might be something that we put on a graph, right? We might have a counter, and it tells us that over time, something is going up and down. We might have a log that over time is telling us that we're seeing a 500 error coming up, right? And we might have a trace that is telling us that between one service and another service, there's a really big delay. And we don't know what that delay is, we just know where it's happening. So between these signal generators, you're actually starting to build a bit of a picture, right? And this was going to be a person's face, but I couldn't work out how to do the smile. There we go, sort of. Anyway, so this SRE is super happy now because it's a work of art, but they're super happy because they've now started to build a picture of what's going on. So in the context of Civo, what are we looking at? Like, what sort of metrics and logs and traces do we need? Well, we have tenant clusters who run Kubernetes, and so we need to understand: are those clusters working? Are those clusters deploying fast enough? What are the errors coming out? And then we run Civo inside of multiple very, very big Kubernetes clusters across different regions. And so we need to understand: is that going to run out of memory? Is it going to run out of CPU? Has it got enough disk space? All these scary existential questions we need to know, because we have to forecast, right? We have to be able to say, well, you know what? We're running out of space. And this is all part of that remit of reliability. So let's take a look. We've talked about Prometheus in an ASS demo, and I want to look at a couple of different metrics. So Prometheus, and I hope you can see it, I've picked a really simple metric. So this one you get for free. So the kubelet, which is one of the Kubernetes components. I'm sure you will have heard if you've been doing your learning on Kubernetes. The kubelet gives us a metric, right? And this metric is telling us a bunch of different labels with a value, right? This is a float at the end, and this is the number of HTTP requests on a particular path for a particular instance. So we can do some really simple querying on this. So we can just count, and we can go by, path or something like that. And we can have a look, and we can see the various different endpoints that have been hit over a period of time, and we can look how often they've been hit. And this is useful, right? Because if I'm concerned about particular access, let's say I have a shutdown cluster and I don't want anybody using it, and suddenly overnight I see it's had 15,000 port forwards, that might lead you to think that something's going on, right? So metrics are useful. And again, at Civo, our metrics are super useful because we want to see how many clusters are building, right? We want to look at cluster build time. We want to see which clusters are building, how long they're taking, so we can optimize. So we want to look and see if cluster build time, under a certain amount of time, so under 300 seconds, and then we can go and look at them and we can start to build up a picture. And this is how we start to create an expression that can be reused. So these expressions, which is effectively the composite of this query, can be used in other tools. So when I talked about logs, traces, and metrics, sometimes we like to be able to look at metrics in a bit more of an aggregated way. I'm not just going to sit here in Prometheus and scroll through these. And that's where Grafana and other visualization tools come in. If we look here on this screen, this is a Grafana dashboard. But behind the scenes, all it uses is Prometheus in this example. There are other tools and services you can use, like Victoria Metrics. But in this example, I've just got a plain old Prometheus query, which is actually producing a dashboard. And that's the USP of Grafana, is it creates these really nice dashboards. And as an SRE team, or as an engineer, I can see when things go red, or if things are returning 500 errors, I know I've got a problem. And this particular example, this is a load balancer. And this load balancer is just reporting on itself and telling us the number of gets it's had. It's telling us the number of 500s it might have had. And at the bottom here, you can see there's a 504. So that's a gateway timeout. You can see a 404, so not found. So these are really useful because we can start to build a picture. And if we're interested in finding out more as an SRE, let's say, for example, somebody's hitting your website and getting 504s, we can start to look into this. We can start to explore and figure out what's going on. And this is all part of that behavior that I spoke about earlier. It's about investing and cultivating that mindset of, okay, I know this is true. What's the next thing? And taking that really incremental approach to diagnostics. So if I've got a 500 error that's coming up in one of these time series, I can start to apply more filters. I can start to look at, well, what was the calling service? What is the other pieces of data? But there's still one thing that I don't know. I don't know how to correlate this to other things. So that's where we have the ability to combine our logs into Prometheus, into Grafana. So we've now got 2 of those signal generators working in tandem here to produce more of a picture. So at this point, it's getting really exciting because I can combine the logs with some of the metrics to correlate when a log event happened with a metric. And what's even more interesting is that I can generate metrics from logs. So if I saw a sudden spike in errors over a period of time, and the customer told me that's exactly when I tried to hit your load balancer, then I can check the load balancer metrics, I can check the logs, and I can see that there's a correlation. But that correlation can also be derived because the logs have embedded labels that will help them to generate metrics, so you can really start to aggregate those data points together. The one other thing that I haven't spoken about is this third component, and this is tracing. Tracing, I would say it's relatively new to the game, but that's incorrect. Tracing's been around a long time, but we've only started to see tracing really used heavily within applications, I'd say in the past 7 or 8 years. Tracing is something that you can embed inside of your cluster, inside your application. So it might be a Kubernetes operator, right? So you have an operator that deploys your clusters, and your tracing might be in this operator and tell you how things are going. Or you might have tracing that's embedded inside your load balancer, and every time somebody makes a request. So if we think about that operator example of tracing, let's have a look at a typical trace from Civo. So this is generating a cluster, and this is using Jaeger's trace UI. I can see what's going on here. I'm creating a key pair, I'm generating a master, creating a node pool, and then grabbing a kube config. And what's really useful about this is it's telling me how long the entire process. So the entire thing took about a second. Creating traces is a great way of being able to get into the really fine-grained data points. And you can add baggage, and you can attach additional metadata within these traces. And what you can also do within tracing is, just like with the other signals, you can combine your tracing, and I think I might have to look at another environment, but you can combine your tracing with tools like Tempo into your Grafana dashboard, so you can actually combine all 3 of these signals together. I've not mentioned profile. I've not mentioned profiling at all, but that's something we also do. So profiling is another signal. In fact, there are many, many other signal generators. So I don't want to mislead you. There are many other signal generators, but these are typically the most popular within SRE. And as you can see, when you start to combine these, you start to make intelligent decisions on what the sort of things are you want to measure. Debugging anything like slow cluster launches or pod restarting starts to become a much easier activity. And the key takeaway is, technology does not matter here. You'll learn the technology. What you're really learning are the behaviors around how you start to diagnose issues, how you start to make those connections. I hope that was interesting.
That was super interesting. Since you have about 15 minutes left, I think we want to take a look at some of the questions that we got. Kunal, you want to jump in? Do you have any questions from the forum? Anything you want to look at?
We do have some questions, and now the live chat is on, so you can also ask your questions live. So yeah, for everyone who has joined, please feel free to share your questions. But yeah, there were similar questions for people who are at the entry level, new grad roles and whatever. So how can I get a role, in the field of SRE as a fresher, or is it possible to gain a SRE job at the entry level? So yeah, those are the 2 questions we got. Most of the questions.
Alex, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll take the latter. So how do you? I guess they're similar in a way. How do you start at entry level? One of the paths that I've found that's quite successful is that often companies are biased and they want experience, and that's really unfair because that doesn't account for merit, right? You can be an excellent engineer, and just because you don't have 5 years under your belt, it instantly means you're excluded. But what you will see is that companies are far more forgiving around support and production support engineering. So one of the things that I think is a good route for potential SREs is to go through support engineering. And so this is typically what you would call L1. So you have L1, L2, and L3 support levels. And what that means is you might start diagnosing very high-level issues, right? So it might be a customer issue that you have to manually look at, and then it might involve you starting to work with more of the technology. And this has been actually a very successful way for folks who don't have a long tenure behind them to get into that space. So I think support engineering and operational support engineering is actually an easier way in. Secondarily to that, many companies are now starting to really understand, as I said earlier, the benefit of having junior SREs, because you've got that incredible mindset and inquisitiveness and wanting to be able to learn these things with a real appetite. And you might see, I can think of a few companies actually in the tech industry who are starting to open up roles for either CNCF interns and also their own internship programs. And there are many, many more coming online. So I wouldn't be disheartened. It's a really good time to get into it.
What I would just add to that, if you want to get started and just try out different things, you can just what I showed you at the beginning. So maybe if you joined later, you didn't see that. There are some tutorials, some also linked below, some just demos that you can click through and get started of like, what are actually the tools that I used behind the scenes, Google them, look them up, and start reading about it. There are lots and lots of open source free learning resources that you can get started with to get a feeling of what are the tools. And then also look at job descriptions and kind of what are asked of in job descriptions and how you could maybe then get started to acquire those skills and start maybe in a kind of a different role, a support engineer or similar, and then build your skills up from there. That would be another approach. Yeah. Awesome. Any other questions?
Most definitely. Yeah, there was one. And by the way, all the links that Anais and Alex shared, I have added those in the description. So once you refresh, you will see those. There was one more question we got in the form, which was a little bit more about the interview process. So if you're applying for an SRE role, what do you expect them to ask you?
That's also one for Alex.
I think it's the answer is that mileage may vary, right? Like there's no sort of critical path for every single organization. It very much depends on what their cultural approach is. I think typically with SRE, you'll be asked a few fundamental questions around, what are SLOs? What are SLIs, so service level indicators? What are some of the techniques involved in observability? What are some of the practices you might have within a team, responsibilities, and like I was talking about earlier, having that escape valve to say, hey, we can't deploy anymore, we can't do this, and being able to talk about that, like being able to talk about what is an error budget and why is that part of the SRE role. And so those are the kind of the interpersonal and team questions, but then there'll also be a technical side. So it might be, coding an exporter for Prometheus in Golang. It might be writing a small script to help loop through queue control and debug some clusters. And then I think the last part of the interview would be typically kind of an activity where you have to look at perhaps some cluster that needs repairing, or look at perhaps some metrics and try and figure out what the underlying or what the possible next step might be. And so I do think that the SRE interviews are quite varied. They're usually made up of 3 to 4 segments like that, but they'll be in different orders and they'll be at different sizes.
Awesome.
Anais, would you like to add something?
I didn't go through like a process like this before, so I can't really add to it. I am coming from the dev advocate space. So.
There's one more question, which is, that's all fine, but how do you actually get some experience, in this field as someone who is fresh out of college?
Yeah,
So I believe they're talking about like without getting a job first, like how do you get the experience for the job? Yeah.
So one of the things that I mentioned earlier, and that's independent if you want to get started in SRE or other roles. So for instance, before I got started within my SRE role at Civo, I used for my developer advocacy job, I used Prometheus, I used Grafana, I used all those different tools within the cloud native landscape. So these are open source, many of them, and you can just get started with them by yourself. And there are lots of free online tutorials that you can use and so on. So just by you having the exposure with those different tools, you can acquire lots of the skills, lots of the technical skills that might be asked within those roles. And that doesn't require you to pay for any certificates or any bootcamps. That doesn't require you to have a job per se. But by you learning how to use those tools, those are really valuable skills. You knowing how the querying language for Prometheus works, that's a really valuable skill. And that's just, that's a specific skills, right? But that will also show that you can learn those skills over time, also by yourself. But yeah, that's one of the ways that I would suggest people get started. And then the CNCF, for instance, has also, like, for example, as part of Thanos, mentoring opportunities, or mentoring opportunities, where you can, for several months, be part of one of those open source projects, collaborate with the maintainers of the project, and acquire lots of those skills. So that's something, if you are still in college or just getting out of college and you want to explore the skills that are needed in the field of SRE, that's what I would suggest you getting started with. But it's my opinion. Maybe Alex has something else to add too.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think just this question here stuck with me, this idea of like, what can you showcase? And also just to add to your answer, when I was starting out doing this stuff, I used my GitHub far more as a playground than I think most people use it, with the mindset of, I have to only put on finished projects there. But I had questions that I wanted answers to, right? So my objective was, I want to learn how to monitor something, with this particular tool. And I thought, okay, what do I want to monitor? Okay, and that led me down the path of, I got to build something. So I built a little Golang application, and then I had to learn how to put it into Docker. Then I had to learn how to get it into Docker Swarm at the time, and then I had to learn to connect. So you go on quite a little journey, and that little journey takes you on different forks, and you soon find out that you're on the internet at 3 a.m. looking up some strange flags for a tool, but you come away from that and you've learned so much, right? Like it's like in Zelda, you come back as Link at the end, and you're like, really, you've got all the additional quest items, and you've figured out all these other things you never thought you were even going to ask a question about. So I think having those kind of like organic journeys of saying, I want to learn about a tool like Grafana, but I want to learn out how can I install it locally, or how do I get started? Just having that question framed in your mind will take you on that journey to be able to start aiming towards those steps.
Awesome. Maybe one last question.
I believe you answered all. So they are just comments now, no questions. But we are about time as well. So one last thing I want to share is check out civo.com/academy for some nice Kubernetes courses for free. You don't even have to add a credit card or anything. Anais, Alex, me, Kai, Sayam, we have created some nice tutorials, and we'll keep on adding more and more. So that's going to be really helpful if you want to get started with K8s. And once again, thanks a lot, Anais and Alex, for joining. The quiz for this session is in the description below, so make sure you attend that, share your views. There's also a feedback section over there, so you can share your feedback, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We'll be bringing you more and more such streams again next week, I believe. Any closing remarks from your side? Maybe you can start with Anais.
Just thank you for joining. That was really fun. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Also, when you join Civo, when you sign up for Civo, you can access the Slack channel and you can ask questions there. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I hope that we gave some insights and really enjoyed being here.
Awesome. Getting a lot of shout outs on the chat. And also, if you enjoyed the session, you can also share your learnings on like Twitter or something. You can tag Alex and Civo, share what you're learning from the bootcamp, so that other people can also join. It's free. It's always, we have a separate playlist on our YouTube channel called the DevOps Bootcamp. So if you missed previous streams, you can watch those. So I see some people are asking, what is DevOps? So that was like the first session, discussed into it very deeply. But yeah, thanks a lot for joining, everyone. We will see you in the next stream, and hope you have a great day and a great night from where you're joining. And see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.